migration as a systemic issue. I think when a person decides to migrate, it's of course an agency thing. I want to migrate because I see opportunities out there that may not be here in the Philippines. So I then decide to do that. If I were to look at, migration in a much more systemic phenomenon, many of our overseas Filipinos go abroad, yes, because they see the opportunities that are out there, especially those who are skilled, because they know that probably they get paid much higher and the perks are better, benefits are better, maybe the quality of life in many places would be better. But for most of our migrants, this has not been an agency thing as much as an issue of economic necessity. Those who cannot find jobs here easily, not only because maybe they don't have the right educational qualifications. Even to be a security guard, you need to have some kind of college degree or even basic types of occupations. You know, um, Requirements are a lot higher, and then the pay is very low. So for many of our migrants, they leave because they have no choice, or they feel they have no choice. It's the only way they can send their children to school, to good schools. The only way they can buy a house. The only way they can pay for medical expenses of family members. So that's why we have to understand the underlying causes of why people migrate, and see that the range of issues. And the reality is that the Philippine economy cannot absorb the labor. We have so much surplus labor, and that's why it welcomes exporting the labor. So even after is it now 5 decades of exporting labor, it's still not an explicit development policy of the Philippine government. But the Philippine government has developed all the institutional support to be able to facilitate and smoothen that export of labor. Several migrants groups, advocacy groups, have been pushing the government to, and even migrants themselves, that if the economic, political environment were conducive to keeping people here, meaning that there are enough jobs and the jobs pay well enough for a decent life, so many of our migrants will not leave. So that's a very macroeconomic look at how migration should really be seen, going deeper as to why people leave. And but the reality is also that the poorest are the ones who cannot actually leave. They cannot afford to even, they say, process their papers. So it's the lower middle who would have enough resources, even if they may mortgage, borrow, to be able to fund their migration. And if society, policymakers have that understanding of migration, then it shouldn't be a question of just providing social protection, because that seems like we have a Department of Migrant Workers, because our Philippine government is committed to protecting our migrant workers, our OFWs. And also they know, in theory, they also say that migration should be seen as a choice by the migrant, by the would-be migrant. But the reality is that there's not that economic and political environment that would keep people from wanting to migrate. Because if given that framework, a more systems approach into look at migration, then we will see we should build all our programs. Okay, you provide social protection for those who will still want to leave, because you cannot stop people from migrating. But that should not be the priority. That's why those of us who are advocating for seeing migration and development, migration should lead towards the country being able to provide for their basic needs, for employment, for decent jobs, for decent pay, for to be able to get that that social protection for themselves and their families right here in the Philippines, so that they don't need to seek outside. Because the government keeps calling OFWs as the heroes, no, the country's heroes, because of the remittances they bring in. And usually the remittances are financial. That's how the value that people see when, of being able to send Filipinos abroad, because they bring in the dollars, they bring in the remittances that help to fuel the economy, that these remittances help to keep the economy afloat in terms of our foreign currency reserves, etc. They keep families sort of solvent, and they provide for the needs, consumption needs of families, and savings and investments. And yet people don't quite understand, they don't see that other side of the psychosocial consequences for the migrants and their families when they migrate. So we are not mindful unless they hear about very sad stories of our OFWs getting raped or actually being killed by employers, especially in certain countries. It's only when they hear those sad stories that they realize, oops, there's that other part of the migration phenomenon. It's not all positive and rosy, that the remittances come in to fuel all the consumption needs, consumption wants of migrant families, but also keeping afloat our economy, keeping businesses afloat. So it is that kind of the need to see migration in terms of its totality, and the positive as well as the negative, so that it balance, and trying to understand the causes of those of why those situations are happening to our migrants, no. And that if we think of programs, we must be able to address, as I said a while ago, not only looking at the social protection part of it, making sure that there are no abuses, the abuses are really addressed, and they have the necessary benefits, they get the right wages. Those are also critical, but at the same time, look at it in terms of how do you empower our migrants so that they are able to build mindsets, to develop mindsets that are not going to see them thinking as victims, or thinking as that's the only thing they can ever reach, that they have no way upwards because they're domestics, and that's how they'll remain even after working 20, 30, 40 years. That there are other opportunities. So that agency also, that one can have the capacity to help if one changes one's mind. And it's like, for example, in the Italian situation, many countries in Europe, maybe in North America, there are many opportunities for migrants that are given by the local governments or by the national government. So say sometimes free capital, especially for women entrepreneurs, training, etc. But many of our Filipino migrants don't take advantage as much as compared to other nationalities, because one, they don't invest enough in the language and knowing and being fluent, so that they can understand what is out there, they can take advantage of those, or that they can actually negotiate with employers for better pay, for better treatment. They can fight, and they can sort of file complaints if needed, etc. So it's as basic as that. Many migrants plan to stay 1 year, 2 years, and then ending up 10, 15, 20 years. So there's not that kind of a planning. There's no, I'd still call that systems. No. If I want, looking forward, I have to be able to plan, so that so that's why we teach appreciative inquiry, so that they look into this, analyzing their situation, and then identifying what are the ways by which they can design, and then the actual move towards implementing the design towards their destiny. So that means really changing mindsets, and getting and saying that yes, this might be my circumstances, some of which can be very, very discouraging, maybe even frustrating, maybe even depressing to some extent. But there are still ways by which one can look at to address some of those. And but it means not just maybe helping oneself, but getting others to collectively help one another and getting the support maybe from outside it as needed.